Today we are going to be talking about how to create a paragraph response using a level 3 question. What we want to make sure that we do before we get started is have our header in the top right space with our last name and the page number. Remember, underneath the header on the left-hand side, you have your heading with your first name, the teacher's name, the class period, and the date that it's going to be due. And then we do have a space for the title that we need to go back and change later. Remember, your title should be creative. It should not be prologue response, Romeo and Juliet response. It needs to be creative. So sometimes we need to make sure we write the paragraph first to really understand what it is that the subject is before we can go back and create that title. So I will make sure to go back at the end and name this response, but for right now, I'm going to put title there so I don't forget that I need to do that. Okay, so to get started, what we need to make sure that we do is number one, answer the level 3 question. Now, whether this level 3 question is a question of your creation or a question that you are given depends on the directions. For the specific example that I'm going to do, I was given a question. My question being, in what ways does Shakespeare use the prologue to encourage the audience? So, my answer to that question, the prologue advises the audience to not be deceived by bias because it will lead them to not fully be able to understand King Henry VIII. Notice how I use a portion of the question in my response, my first sentence. The prologue advises the audience, and then I answer the question to not be deceived by bias because it will lead them to not fully be able to understand the message of, and then I name the title of what I'm going to be referencing and pulling evidence from, which in this case is a play, King Henry VIII. So step one, again, make sure that you answer the question. Step two now is to provide text-based evidence, quotes from whatever it is that you're referencing that supports your answer to the question. So I need to find quotes that show that the audience should not be deceived by bias. So once I find my quote, I establish a good starting point for it, especially if it doesn't fit perfectly into my essay. So I establish that by saying an idea established at the beginning of the prologue is. And then I insert my quote with quotation marks so that it is known that this is coming directly from that play. Those that can pity here may, if they think it well, let fall a tear. Their money out of hope they may believe, may here find truth too. The very last thing I need to do is put end quotations and then do an in-text citation. The in-text citation here is the author's last name, and then we have where it is from in the play and the line numbers. Remember, usually if it's not the prologue, you need the act and the scene. If it's not a play at all, it's usually just the author's last name and the page number. But for this example, we're doing a play, so we need the author's last name, where it's from in the play, and the line numbers. So I have Shakespeare, prologue, 5, 6, 8, 9. Remember that if your quote is too long, it is acceptable to pull from different parts of the play as long as you are citing it properly. And if you have any questions about that, you can always ask later. Moving on, after we have our quote, we need to make sure that we explain the connection between our answer and the quote. So, in my explanation, I say, by advising the audience to respond emotionally to the play, Shakespeare expects the audience to grow beyond the bias that money can only buy material possessions. If spent wisely, money can lead to deeper understanding. Before you move on to continue going, you need to make sure that you made the connection clearly to your answer to the question. So if my answer was that the prologue advises the audience to not be deceived by bias, did I make sure in my explanation that I connected to that idea? Expects the audience to grow beyond the bias? I did. So make sure you do that before you move on. Remember, we have to continue writing because in a level 3 response, we're expected to show multiple ways. So I have to keep writing. The way that I transition to my second example is by piggybacking off of the idea of there needing to be a deeper understanding. So, as you see here, I talked about the prologue shows that you can be led to a deeper understanding. So when I set up my next quote, I'm piggybacking off that idea. The prologue goes on to illustrate deeper understanding through the expectation that the nobility of the story are expected to be seen as thriving, but. Then I insert my quote, in a moment, see how soon the mightiness meets misery. Then I have my citation, just like we did before, with the author's last name, where it is in the play, the prologue, and the line numbers. Then I do my connection once again to my answer. So we have, this establishes that the audience should not allow their bias to impact how they interpret the story. Again, I'm making the connection about the bias. Furthermore, encouraging the audience that painful emotions can be experienced by anyone regardless of their social class. All right, just to recap everything, you need to make sure you respond to the question with their own answer. You find text-based evidence that supports that answer, and then you explain how that text-based evidence connects to the answer. Then you repeat that one more time. Once you're done with all of that, you can go ahead and go back and make sure that you title this response. Remember, the title should be creative. So if I'm thinking about what I just wrote, it seemed that the theme was that the audiences needed to go beyond the personal bias that they have in order to better understand the play. So I might say, seeing beyond the bias. Remember, the title does not need to be in a 16-point font and some crazy font. If you want to make it very noticeable that it is the title, you can bold it, but that's really all you need to do. If you have any questions about the response or how to write it, please make sure you ask. If you're still having trouble with MLA format, make sure to check the How To for Writing Essays PowerPoint to get some help with formatting your paper in MLA format.